The most stable-looking phase of the cycle is always the one directly before the transfer becomes visible to the people carrying it. Three of the most sophisticated economies in modern history reached a point where everything looked stable right up until the month it didn't. In 1921, Germany had a functioning government, an operating legislature, and a currency that still bought groceries. 2 years later, a civil servant was spending his entire monthly salary at lunch because the price of bread would be higher by dinner, not because the government collapsed. Because the cost of a decade of obligation had to go somewhere, and it went into the purchasing power of ordinary people. In 1991, Japan was the world's second-largest economy. Its corporations owned landmark buildings in Manhattan. Its banks were considered among the most stable on Earth. Then a single interest rate decision began a correction that took 34 years to fully reverse, not through war, not through revolution, but through the slow arithmetic of liabilities that had accumulated quietly inside institutions that appeared, from the outside, entirely sound. In 2001, Argentina had a currency praised by the IMF, savings accounts denominated in dollars, a middle class that considered itself modern and protected. Within 72 hours of a government decree, those dollar accounts were converted to pesos and repriced. The savings didn't disappear. They relocated from household balance sheets into the gap between what the state owed and what it could pay. Three systems, three different architectures, one consistent mechanism underneath. The United States is in phase 3 of what this documentary calls the Liability Transfer Cycle, the phase where the weight of accumulated obligation begins moving outward into consumer prices, into retirement accounts, into the gap between what households earn and what stability actually costs. The transfer is not announced. It shows up the way a structural problem shows up in a house, first in the corners, then in the walls, and finally in a place you can no longer ignore. If you want to understand how Phase 3 becomes Phase 4 before that transition is the only thing anyone is talking about, stay with this video. That understanding is exactly what this is built to give you. The model has 5 phases, and the way each phase ends is never the way the people inside it expected. Before we move into the cases, it helps to understand exactly what kind of system we're describing, because the liability transfer cycle is not a theory about political collapse, and it is not a prediction about markets. It is a description of how modern institutional systems handle obligations they cannot pay from current income. And the answer, in nearly every documented case, is that they don't eliminate those obligations. They route them somewhere else. Think about how a corporate pension worked in America 40 years ago. A company made a promise to its workers. Work here for 30 years, and we will pay you a defined monthly amount for the rest of your life. That promise was a liability sitting on the company's balance sheet, real, measurable, and owned by the institution that made it. Then, over the course of 2 decades, most of those companies converted their retirement plans from defined benefit structures to defined contribution structures. They called it modernization. They called it giving workers more control. What they did not say in the press release was that the liability had been moved off the corporate balance sheet and onto the personal balance sheet of every individual employee, most of whom were not trained to manage it, and most of whom had no idea what institutional risks they had just absorbed. The cost did not disappear. It relocated. That is the core mechanism of the liability transfer cycle. An institution, a government, a central bank, a financial architecture accumulates obligations faster than it generates the revenue to service them. Rather than restructuring those obligations through formal adjustment, which is politically costly and institutionally painful, the system routes the weight forward in time, outward to other populations, or downward through the economic structure. It does this through inflation, which transfers purchasing power from savers to debtors. It does this through deficit financing, which transfers costs from present taxpayers to future ones. It does this through asset price inflation, which transfers wealth from those who own assets to those who do not. And it does this through the quiet conversion of institutional promises into individual responsibilities announced in fine print, absorbed slowly, understood only much later. If the cost of sustaining a system is constantly being relocated rather than resolved, where does it eventually run out of places to go? That is what the 5 phases describe, not a countdown, a sequence. And each phase has a distinct signature, a way it feels from the inside, and a set of indicators that, in retrospect, were visible before the transition arrived. Phase 1 is obligation accumulation. The institution takes on more financial commitment than its current revenue structure can service through wartime spending, entitlement expansion, credit extension, or monetary stimulus. During Phase 1, the economy often feels healthy because the spending itself is stimulative. Credit is available. Growth continues. The headline numbers look functional. The obligation is accumulating quietly, the way water accumulates behind a dam that has not yet shown a crack. Phase 2 is internal transfer. The institution begins moving costs between its own accounts, borrowing from one program to fund another, suppressing interest rates to reduce the carrying cost of existing debt, expanding the central bank's balance sheet to absorb obligations that the open market would price more honestly. During Phase 2, specialists begin to notice. But from the outside, the system still appears to be functioning because the weight is still being managed within institutional walls. Think of a hospital billing department that has marked every procedure up 400% and then applied a negotiated discount. The bill looks like a bargain, the system appears to work, and the real price remains invisible until the patient loses their coverage and sees the underlying number for the first time. Phase 3 is external transfer. This is where the weight begins, moving outward into consumer prices, into the cost of housing, into the gap between what wages grow and what assets cost, into the retirement accounts of households absorbing institutional risk they were never formally told they were carrying. Phase 3 is where the transfer stops being an internal accounting decision and starts being a lived experience. It is the phase where a family in a mid-sized American city notices that their grocery bill has increased by 30%, that their rent has increased by 40%, that their health insurance deductible has doubled, and that their 401k has experienced 2 significant corrections in the same decade. They feel the weight. They do not yet have a name for the mechanism producing it. Phase 4 is transfer exhaustion. The receiving population households, municipalities, mid-sized businesses can no longer absorb additional cost without visible institutional stress. Leverage is maxed. Savings are depleted. The deferred obligations that were managed quietly in Phases 1 and 2 begin surfacing in public data, in corporate earnings calls, in municipal budget shortfalls. Institutional trust erodes rapidly in Phase 4, not because people suddenly become cynical, but because the mechanism becomes visible, and visibility produces recognition, and recognition produces a kind of pressure that is harder to manage than the original obligation ever was. Phase 5 is structural reset. The system reprices. Through inflation spike, currency restructuring, sovereign debt negotiation, or institutional redesign, the accumulated obligations are finally acknowledged and distributed. Phase 5 is where the cost that has been relocating for years arrives at a final address, and the people standing at that address, when the accounting closes, absorb the largest portion of what the system could not pay. That is the model. 5 phases, 1 mechanism, and a history of documented examples that show exactly how each transition arrived, not announced, not predicted by the institutions managing the process, but visible in retrospect to anyone reading the arithmetic carefully enough. The cases are where the mechanism stops being abstract. Germany, 1919. The war was over, but the balance sheet was not. The Weimar Republic inherited the financial architecture of an imperial government that had spent 4 years financing a total war, not through taxation, but through debt domestic bonds sold to German citizens on the promise of post-war repayment, and a printing apparatus already expanding the money supply to cover the gap between what the war cost and what the treasury held. When the armistice arrived, Germany owed reparations denominated in gold marks, a foreign currency obligation in all but name, while its own revenue was denominated in paper marks already losing value against the benchmark. This is Phase 1 in compressed form, an obligation so large, so externally imposed, and so structurally disconnected from the economy's productive capacity that the government faced an immediate accounting problem with no clean resolution. The political will for formal restructuring did not exist. So the transfer began. Phase 2 arrived quickly. The Reichsbank began expanding the money supply to cover government operating costs, reparations, installments, and the fiscal gap left by a disrupted tax base. Between 1919 and 1921, the expansion was gradual enough that the economy continued to function. Exports became competitively priced as the mark weakened. Employment was relatively high. The internal transfer was working, cost was moving through the monetary system rather than through the budget, and from the outside, the economy appeared to be recovering. By 1921 and into 1922, Phase 3 arrived. The external transfer became visible in prices. A German civil servant whose monthly salary covered rent and groceries in January would find that same salary covered significantly less by June, and almost nothing by December. The cost was not moving through tax bills or austerity programs. It was moving through the purchasing power of every German holding marks. Every saver who had bought a war bond on the promise that the government would repay its obligations in currency worth what they had deposited, the liability had transferred. The savings of a generation of middle-class households absorbed the gap between what the state owed and what it could pay. By November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. The numbers are so extreme that they can feel fictional from the distance of a century, but the mechanism that produced them was not exotic. It was the same routing logic that moves through every Phase 3 system cost, seeking a new address, finding it in the least politically organized populations, arriving faster than those populations could respond. The structural reset came through a currency replacement, the Rentenmark, introduced in November 1923, exchanged at 1 to 1 trillion. The old obligations were effectively extinguished. Phase 5 had arrived, and the cost in the end was borne by every German who had held the old currency, every household that had done what the system asked them to do. What Germany shows is the cycle at maximum compression, all 5 phases in roughly 4 years, with a monetary mechanism as the transfer vehicle. But compression is not the only way the cycle runs. Sometimes the system finds a way to hold Phase 4 at bay for decades, redistributing stress across time rather than concentrating it in a single repricing event. And that version of the cycle is, in many ways, harder to recognize while you are inside it. Japan entered the 1980s as the world's most admired economic model. Its corporations were acquiring American landmarks. Its banks were considered structurally sound by every external measure. Its real estate market had appreciated so dramatically that, at the peak in 1989, the land beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was estimated to be worth more than all the real estate in California. That number is worth sitting with not as an indicator of Japanese success, but as an indicator of how far valuation had separated from the productive capacity of the underlying asset. The mechanism behind the bubble was Phase 1 and Phase 2 operating in coordination. The Bank of Japan had suppressed interest rates through the 1980s to support export competitiveness and maintain alignment with U.S. monetary policy. Cheap credit flowed into real estate and equity markets. Banks extended loans against collateral that was increasing in value, which made the loans appear sound and the banks appear healthy. The obligation was accumulating not on government balance sheets, but inside the credit architecture of the financial system, in the gap between what assets were worth on paper and what they would be worth if anyone tried to sell them all at once. In 1989, the Bank of Japan raised interest rates. The asset price correction began. What followed was not a crash in the traditional sense, it was a slow deflation, a sustained repricing that transferred the cost of accumulated obligations across 30 years rather than 4. Banks held non-performing loans rather than recognizing losses, because recognition would have required acknowledging that the system's internal accounting had been, for years, disconnected from underlying reality. Every tool available for Phase 2 internal management was deployed, and deployed again, and the effect was to extend Phase 3 across an entire generation. A mid-career Japanese professional who bought a home in 1988 using the standard multi-generational mortgage structure found themselves by 1995 holding a property worth half the outstanding loan balance, with a bank that had not modified a single term of the contract. The cost of the financial system's accumulated obligations had transferred onto that household's balance sheet, one monthly payment at a time, across a decade where wages stagnated and asset values did not recover. The Nikkei stock index took 34 years to return to its 1,989 peak. That is not a correction. That is a structural holding pattern, a phase 4 managed rather than resolved, an economy that chose the slow version of the transfer, distributing cost across demographics and decades in a way that was politically survivable but economically suffocating for the households inside it. Japan never fully reached phase 5. The reset was managed into a permanent condition of institutional maintenance, zero rates, government debt exceeding 200% of GDP, a demographic structure in which the population absorbing the obligation was steadily shrinking. The cycle did not end. It slowed to a pace where it could be administered rather than confronted. And that raises a question that matters more than it might initially appear. Is a system that successfully delays phase 5 indefinitely actually stable, or is it simply running the transfer at a speed that makes it invisible to the people carrying it? Argentina in 2001 is the third case, and it is the most instructive for the present moment, not because Argentina and the United States share an economic architecture, but because it shows how a system can hold phase 3 stability for a decade through an external anchor, and then arrive at phase 5 not gradually, but over a single weekend. In 1991, Argentina was emerging from a period of hyperinflation that had destroyed the previous peso and wiped out an entire generation's savings. The government's solution was the convertibility plan, a currency board that pegged the new peso to the US dollar at 1-to-1, backed by the requirement that every peso in circulation be matched by $1 in reserve. The plan worked. Inflation collapsed. Investment returned. The middle class rebuilt savings accounts, this time denominated in dollars, in a system formally endorsed by the IMF as a model of monetary discipline. What the stability concealed was phase 1 still running underneath. The government was continuing to run fiscal deficits, spending more than it collected, and financing those deficits by borrowing in dollars. The currency peg meant it could not inflate away its obligations the way Germany had. The liabilities were real and fixed. And through the 1990s, the gap between what Argentina owed and what its economy could produce in dollar terms grew quietly, masked by the apparent stability of the exchange rate and the continued availability of international credit. Phase 3 began arriving around 1998 as a regional recession reduced export revenues and made the dollar peg increasingly difficult to maintain. Unemployment climbed, the economy contracted, and the government's response, fiscal austerity required by IMF lending conditions, transferred the cost of the structural imbalance directly onto household income, cutting wages and compressing the living standards of the middle class that had spent a decade believing the system had been fixed. By 2001, the bank runs had started. Households who had watched the hyperinflation of the 1980s destroy savings once were not prepared to watch it happen again. The government's response was the Corralito, a decree freezing bank accounts and limiting weekly withdrawals to a small fixed amount. An Argentine pharmacist, a school teacher, a mid-level accountant, people who had done everything the institutional architecture asked of them, who had saved in dollars, who had trusted the peg, found themselves standing in lines outside banks, unable to access their own money, watching the government negotiate how much of their savings would ultimately be returned to them in a currency about to be worth significantly less. In December 2001, the sovereign default was announced $100 billion, the largest in history at that point. The peg was abandoned. Dollar accounts were converted to pesos at the old 1-to-1 rate. Then the peso was devalued by approximately 70%. The transfer that had been building for a decade arrived in a single policy decree. The cost had not appeared from nowhere. It had been accumulating inside the gap between what the state owed and what the economy could produce, waiting for the moment when the external credit holding, phase 3 stable, ran out. What Argentina shows is that an external anchor can hold the system in phase 3 well past the point where the internal arithmetic has already moved toward phase 4. The stability is real in the sense that people experience it as stability. The instability is also real in the sense that the obligations are accumulating regardless of what the surface conditions suggest. and the gap between those two realities closes in the form of a transition that arrives faster than the people inside the system can respond. 3 cases, 3 different mechanisms, 1 pattern underneath. It is worth pausing here and holding the 3 cases side by side, because the structure they share is more important than the differences between them. Germany ran the liability transfer cycle at maximum speed currency expansion as the transfer vehicle, repricing arriving in months rather than years. Japan ran the cycle at minimum speed asset price deflation, institutional paralysis, and a Phase 4 management strategy that stretched the transfer across 3 decades. Argentina ran the cycle behind an external anchor, a decade of apparent stability, followed by a transfer that arrived not gradually but over a weekend. In all 3 cases, the cost did not disappear. It relocated, from the state to the household, from the institution to the individual, from the present to a future that eventually arrived. The United States is in Phase 3. The indicators are in the quarterly data. The transfer is already in motion, not as a future event, but as a current condition being experienced in grocery bills and mortgage rates and retirement account volatility and the widening gap between what skilled, employed Americans earn and what stability in an American city actually costs. The mechanism is running. The question the 3 historical cases cannot answer is how long Phase 3 continues before the system moves to Phase 4, and whether the transition, when it arrives, looks more like Germany, more like Japan, or more like Argentina. That is not a rhetorical question, it is the structural question. And the answer depends on factors visible right now, in current institutional behavior, in refinancing calendars, in actuarial projections, in the Federal Reserve's balance sheet management decisions, in the trajectory of mandatory federal spending against total tax revenue. None of those factors are hidden. What they require is not access to secret information. They require a model for reading what the information means. In Phase 3, the United States carries several indicators that align with historical Phase 3 signatures with a consistency that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. Federal mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest payments on existing debt has reached a level where, taken together, these obligations exceed total federal tax revenue as a structural baseline. This is not a projection. This is the arithmetic of the current budget. Discretionary spending, covering defense, infrastructure, education, and every other government function that can technically be reduced, is being funded entirely through borrowing. Phase 1 is still running inside Phase 3. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from approximately $900 billion in 2008 to $9 trillion. At its peak in 2022, a tenfold increase over 14 years. Driven by asset purchase programs designed to suppress long-term interest rates. 14 consecutive years of suppressed interest rates was Phase 2 internal transfer operating at a scale not previously seen in the American monetary system, routing the cost of financial system obligations through artificially low borrowing costs, transferring real economic burden onto every saver, every retiree on fixed income, every pension fund required to meet actuarial return targets in an environment where safe assets return nothing. The external transfer into households, Phase 3 is visible in data points that, taken individually, might appear to be temporary inflationary episodes, but taken together describe a structural pattern. Shelter inflation has remained persistently elevated, driven by the gap between asset prices inflated by a decade of monetary stimulus and the income levels of households attempting to access housing for the first time. The defined benefit pension, which once covered 62% of private sector workers, now covers fewer than 17%, the rest having converted to defined contribution structures that transferred retirement risk onto individual households. Credit card balances are at record levels, with average interest rates exceeding 21%, meaning a meaningful portion of American household consumption is being financed through revolving credit that compounds faster than most household income grows. These are not symptoms of a single policy mistake. They are the sequential indicators of a system routing cost outward through the mechanisms of Phase 2 now arriving in the lived experience of households that did not design the system and were not formally told they were absorbing its obligations. Phase 4 early signals are also present, though they exist at the institutional layer rather than the household layer, which is consistent with how Phase 4 has arrived in historical cases. The commercial real estate market carries approximately $1.5 trillion in loans originated at low rates, now entering refinancing cycles at substantially higher ones. Municipal pension systems in more than 20 states carry underfunded actuarial obligations that cannot be met without reduced benefits, increased contributions, or restructuring. Neither adjustment has been formally initiated at scale. The obligations are sitting, waiting for the budget cycle or market condition that makes them impossible to continue deferring. None of this means Phase 4 is imminent in the way a specific event is imminent. What it means is that the architecture of Phase 3 is carrying a structural load that historical precedent suggests cannot be managed indefinitely through the same internal tools that produced Phase 2. What moves a system from Phase 3 to Phase 4 is not a single event. It is a convergence, the moment when the tools available for managing Phase 3 each reach their limits simultaneously, and the system no longer has room to continue the transfer without it becoming visible at a scale that changes institutional behavior. In Germany, that convergence arrived when international creditors stopped accepting German paper and the reparations schedule demanded hard currency the Treasury did not hold. In Japan, the convergence has arguably not fully arrived, held at bay through permanent deficit financing and permanent zero interest rates. In Argentina, it arrived when the international credit funding, the peso peg, ran out, and the currency board's reserve requirement could not be sustained against the capital flight already underway. In the United States, the transition from Phase 3 to Phase 4 would not come from a single political event or market correction. It would come from three conditions arriving together. The first is liquidity constraint, meeting rollover pressure refinancing cost exceeding the system's capacity to absorb it without visible stress at major institutional levels. The second is policy exhaustion, the available tools of Phase 3 management, each reaching their political or actuarial limits, leaving the institutional machinery that has been routing cost forward with nowhere further to route it. The third is trust velocity, the speed of institutional credibility erosion, outpacing the speed at which reassurance can be delivered. When that ratio inverts, Phase 4 behavior begins appearing in multiple places at once, rather than one at a time. If the system requires permanent expansion to remain solvent, if the only way to service existing obligations is to continue accumulating new ones, then the system's stability is contingent on a condition that is, by definition, finite. Germany ran out of space in months. Japan has held space for 3 decades. Argentina held space for 10 years and then did not hold it for a weekend. The timing is never predetermined by the model, but the direction, in every documented case, has been consistent. Understanding the mechanism does not automatically produce a response. In the historical record, the responses of ordinary people caught inside a Phase 3 to Phase 4 transition sort into 3 categories, each with its own set of downstream consequences. The first is drift. Not laziness and not ignorance. Drift is the response of a person who feels something is wrong but lacks a framework for the mechanism, and therefore cannot distinguish a structural shift from temporary noise. The Argentine middle class, they kept savings in dollar accounts until the corralito was not naive. They were paying attention to the wrong layer of the system. Drift means responding to surface conditions, while the mechanism underneath moves in a different direction. The second is emotional reaction, responding to Phase 3 indicators as if they are the final signal, making structural decisions at the peak of visible pressure after the mechanism has already moved past the point of maximum leverage. In Germany in 1922, households began hoarding physical goods as inflation accelerated. This was a rational individual response. The problem was timing. The reaction arrived after the transfer had already largely completed. Action taken after the mechanism has passed, its leverage point produces the most concentrated individual loss. The third is something quieter and more durable. Understanding the structure, reading the phase, and repositioning the mental model before the transition arrives in a form that no longer requires interpretation. What the people in each historical case who navigated the transition with the most resilience shared was not special information. It was a model for reading which phase the system was in, what the transition trigger looked like based on historical precedent, and how institutions behaved in Phase 4 based on documented evidence rather than official communication. The cost is going somewhere. The mechanism is running. The question is not whether the transfer continues. The historical record on that point is consistent. The question is whether the people inside the system have a model for reading where it is going before it arrives at their address. Each of the three historical cases suggests that the window between a system entering Phase 4 and the Phase 5 repricing arriving is narrower than the people inside that window typically believe. Germany compressed the window to months. Argentina compressed it to a weekend. Japan extended it across decades through institutional coordination that may not be replicable in other contexts. The United States has institutional depth that none of the three historical cases possessed a global reserve currency, the deepest capital market in the world, and a record of adaptation across 2 centuries of structural stress. What that depth provides is time. What it does not provide is immunity from the arithmetic. The cost accumulating inside the liability transfer cycle does not resolve itself because the institution holding it is large or historically significant. It resolves when the system's capacity to route it forward is exhausted through policy, through demographics, through the debt refinancing calendar, through the moment when the population absorbing the transfer reaches the limit of what it can carry without the mechanism becoming the dominant reality of the era. That moment does not appear on a calendar. What it does appear on is the same kind of data that was visible in Germany before the hyperinflation accelerated, in Japan before the bubble peaked, and in Argentina before the bank run started. Not hidden data, not classified projections, public arithmetic. Read through a model that describes what the numbers mean in sequence rather than in isolation. The liability transfer cycle is not a theory about collapse. It is a description of how systems handle obligations they cannot pay by moving the weight, progressively and quietly, until the population receiving that weight can no longer carry it, without the transfer becoming the dominant reality of their economic lives. 5 phases, 1 mechanism. A historical record across 3 separate monetary architectures showing the same sequence running, at different speeds, toward the same structural logic. We are in Phase 3. The transfer is not approaching. It is already in motion, already present in the cost of housing, in the structure of retirement, in the gap between what wages grow and what stability costs. The institutions managing Phase 3 are doing what institutions in Phase 3 have always done, using the available tools to route the cost forward, with enough technical competence that the mechanism remains legible only to those reading the architecture rather than the headlines. The system does not care whether you believe in it. That is the line that matters most, because every historical case contains the same population, people who were not ideologically opposed to the system, not politically engaged against it, simply unaware that the mechanism was running and that they were standing at one of its addresses. The German saver who kept marks in a bank account through 1922 was not naive. The Argentine depositor who trusted the dollar peg through 2000 was not careless. They were both operating without a model for what the system was doing underneath the conditions they could see. 3 responses are available, and the historical record documents all 3. The first is drift continuing inside the system's surface conditions without a framework for the mechanism, the way a homeowner keeps making minimum payments on a loan they haven't read since closing, trusting that the terms haven't changed because nothing has arrived yet to suggest otherwise. The second is emotional reaction, responding to Phase 3 indicators as the final signal, taking structural action after the mechanism has already moved past the point of maximum leverage. The third is something quieter and more durable, understanding the structure, reading the phase, repositioning the mental model before the transition arrives in a form that no longer requires interpretation. The cost does not disappear. That has been the motif underneath every case this documentary examined, and it is the line the historical record keeps returning to. It relocates. The only variable in Germany, in Japan, in Argentina, and in any system running this mechanism forward is who is holding it when the relocation completes. Think of a 401k statement arriving in the mail in a year the market has corrected. Most people fold it and put it in a drawer without reading the second page. where the fee disclosure sits in small print beneath a number that is lower than it was the year before. The mechanism is on that second page. It has always been on that second page. The question is not whether it is there. The question is whether you are the kind of person who reads it. The next phase will not announce itself before it arrives. It will show up first in institutional data, in refinancing calendars, in the actuarial language of documents that most people are never handed. On this channel, we continue tracing the mechanism as it evolves because the distance between structural awareness and structural surprise is exactly the distance between reading the second page and putting it back in the drawer. If the weight has to land somewhere and you are already inside the system that is carrying it, what does it mean to understand the load before it arrives at your address?